morning.
Good morning.
I want to make certain that the microphone's on and we're recording. I'm Barbara Oswithy, Mayor, and chairing this meeting. We'll start with actually, I like to start with a land acknowledgement, and it represents my statement, not council's or individual councilors. We'll just start with that. For thousands of years, this region was home to numerous people and tribes and nations. Each had their distinct culture, artistic expression, and community mores. In particular, this region was the ancestral home of the Nuche, Dene, Pueblo, Hopi, multiple Apache bands, and various other tribes and Latinx people who used and stewarded this land. I recognize that indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands by the U.S. government. It is therefore important to recognize that the narrative of this region has mostly been told from the dominant perspective, without recognition of those who came before us, who to this day continue to thrive, create, and connect with this land. Thank you for your respect in acknowledging this legacy. So I think we're going to get started with some going around and introducing ourselves, but I'm actually going to turn to the chief because I think that's some new board members that we haven't met, so maybe you want to do a little bit more of an introduction with them.
Yeah, you bet, and I'll be brief and let them talk about themselves. But on our team here today is our district's attorney Bud Smith, Kathy Morris, Samantha Gallagher, who is our new board president. Is that what I'm supposed to call her now? Not chairman, president, right? John Diesendorf, Lyle McKnight, Karen Barger, and Deputy Chief Brandon Black is here, and I'm Hal Dowdy, the fire chief. And I would welcome you guys to tell the group if you want to.
Sure. So I'm Samantha Gallagher. I'm the new board president. I am currently the CFO at Fort Lewis College, and previous to that, I was the CFO of Durango School District. And I'm a local. I grew up here. My family has been in the Durango area since the late 1890s.
Anybody else want to? I am going to ask us to go around just so for the record so that we introduce and say who all is here. So how about Bud, if I start with you?
Okay, I'm Bud Smith, General Counsel of the Fire District.
Good morning, I'm Kathy Morris, I'm the board member for the Fire Protection District. Samantha Gallagher, board president, Durango Fire Protection District.
I'm Cynthia Sneed, the finance director for the city.
Eric Barger, Durango Fire Protection District board.
John Diesendorf, Durango Fire Board.
Lyle McKnight, Durango Fire.
Hal Dowdy, Fire Chief.
Barbara Oswithy, Mayor.
Kim Baxter, Durango City Council.
Olivier Bosman, City Councilor.
Melissa Youssef, Durango City Council. Jessica Buell, Durango City Council.
Jose Madrigal, Durango City Manager. I'm Dirk Nelson, City Attorney. Bryce Grant, Durango Police Department. Randy Black, Deputy Chief Operations.
Great, thank you. So we have two items on the agenda today. And I just want to make certain that people are agreed to that agenda, the certificate of participation, informational kind of presentation, and then also updates from both parties. And I think that'll also the panel meeting discussion. So is everybody comfortable with that agenda? Perfect. I'm looking at Cynthia. She's our finance director, and I think you're going to introduce.
Yes, so happy to. Cynthia Sneed, finance director for the city, and in the context of these negotiations, we have invited our financial advisory firm, which is Untitled Securities. We've got Jason and Maggie. We're going to talk about it's specifically certificates of participation, but also other possible financing mechanisms. We want to get this topic out there early and often as we're entering these negotiations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason and Maggie.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm assuming you can hear me okay? Well, again, this is Jason Simmons with Hilltop Securities. Appreciate the time. We do serve as the municipal financial advisor to the city of Durango and have had similar conversations with the fire district as well. Our background is serving as a financial advisor to Colorado municipalities across the state and helping them achieve all of their financing needs for financing capital projects. So this morning we are here to talk about just general overview of COPs. We are going to start talking through kind of a thought process of how to use COPs versus other kind of voted debt. I'm sure you're all very aware of Tabor and the requirements of Tabor, but we've kind of laid out a flow chart to kind of think through the process of how you may get to COPs versus other types of debt for capital projects. And then we will talk a little bit more specifically about the combined fire station, police station project that the city and the fire district are working on. So again, Jason Simmons, I've been in this business for over 20 years in Colorado. I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Maddie Pradanovic, and she will introduce herself, and then we will get going through the presentation. We will stop, and please to see if there are any questions, but please feel free to interrupt us and ask questions as we're going through it.
Thanks, Jason. Good morning. This is Maddie Pradanovic. I've been at Hilltop for a little over 5 years and worked in Colorado Public Finance for a little over 7. So really looking forward to speaking with you all today. This is meant to be, we're here to help and answer questions. So obviously, as we're going through this, if something pops up, just, stop us. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm assuming you all are looking at something given the direction you all are facing. So are you all able to see that?
No, we're not seeing the screen share.
Let me. Okay, how about now?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to kind of start off through the first part of this, and Jason will jump in, and then we'll kind of flip flop. But like I said, if anybody has questions, please, stop us as we're going through. From a big picture perspective, today our agenda really is to just talk about an overview of COPs. That's going to start with really more of sort of a fundamental discussion about different types of obligations that the city and the fire district both have available to them as far as debt or financing issuances, and then financing considerations specifically for this project. So this is, I don't know if this is going to be too small based on the screen you all are looking at, but we try to put together a flow chart that sort of says, how do you come about the decision to issue COPs for a project versus some other form of obligation? And where that really starts is, do you have revenues available annually to support some type of payment? And, basically flowing from that, whether that the answer is yes or no, that determines sort of what options are available to you. If the answer, to kind of keep the short side here on the right, then if the answer is no, then you essentially know that you need to go to voters for some type of tax increase and or debt question. That could look like just on the city side specifically, just a sales tax increase. On, the fire district or city side, that could be a tax increase and debt question. So looking something more like a general obligation bond akin to what a school district would typically ask for. With the combined ballot question and tax increase, you have a few options available to you. One would be, sales and use tax revenue bonds on the city side. For both of you all, the general obligation bonds, so backed by, property taxes with a dedicated mill levy. And then finally, a limited tax GO bond / general fund bonds. We typically really only see that on cities, and that would sort of be a combination of some type of tax increase and existing revenue stream for repayment, but with no full faith and credit pledge, essentially. So no requirement that if you have to increase a mill levy to pay debt service if the revenues generated from that are insufficient. So moving more towards the yes side, because I think that's what we're focusing our conversation more on today, is if you have revenues available for payments on some type of obligation, you can go down the path of certificates of participation, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail here in a minute, or you still can go down the path of voter authorized debt. And that really depends on sort of what type of community input you're looking for, the strength of sort of the credit obligation that comes along with that. With voter authorized debt, really, you would be limited to sales and use tax revenue bonds with existing revenues of those, right? We're not talking about a tax increase now. And then that same limited tax GO bond pledge. So essentially pledging your, on the city side, a general fund revenue pledge. Certificates of participation are really common. The two main hurdles, I guess, or the one main hurdle there is you need leased property. So it functions as essentially an underlying lease purchase agreement where the issuer is leasing that property to a bank or trustee and then leasing it back from them. So in order to issue COPs, there needs to be property available to serve in that context. And then the one major benefit of COPs is they do not require voter authorization since they are not considered a multi-year obligation under TABOR. So we won't be talking about necessarily any of the other options as far as sort of, you know, a GO bond or sales use tax revenue bonds today, unless those questions come up. We're happy to discuss if that's useful, but you know, our conversation today is focused more on COP since that seems to kind of be the direction that both the city and the fire district are leaning towards. But really just wanted to give you all sort of a big picture of, you know, when we start talking with clients about needing to finance a project, this is sort of the thought process of what we think through when we're having those conversations. So moving on to the specifics of COPs and the legal structure behind it. So like I said, it is not a debt under TABOR. It is not a multi-fiscal year obligation because it is subject to annual appropriation, just like you are renting a building. So it is a very, very common financing mechanism within the state of Colorado, particularly for cities that have available revenues such as sales tax revenues to support this type of an obligation. That under this transaction, the issuer, so either the city or fire district, you know, in this context, enters into a lease for that leased property with a bank or trustee, and then you are leasing it back. Those lease payments subject to that original lease to the bank or trustee are subject to annual appropriation. So essentially part of the budget approval process every year. You are obviously technically not legally required to appropriate those funds. The language typically within those documents is essentially a best effort to appropriate annually. Obviously, if you chose not to appropriate, that would be a problem. It still looks like a default as if you didn't pay, you know, your debt service on a bond. But there are some legal nuances there as to why that looks a little bit different. You are able to maintain use of the property throughout the entire lease term of the financing. So from your side of things, there's a lot of legal work that's happening behind the scenes, but your use and access to the facility doesn't change. You still maintain ownership under a normal COP issuance. We're going to talk a little bit about your specific situation in a minute. But you still maintain ownership, you still have access to it, you still have a right to use it. There's just some work that's happening behind the scenes between a lease and a site lease and some documents that get recorded from a title perspective. So if you were to pull title on the property, it shows up that there's a lien on that based on the COP, the outstanding obligation. Any questions about legal structure before I kind of move into?
I had a question. So when you're leasing the property to the bank or the trustee, are they making a lump sum payment to you and then the lease is paying off that lump sum payment?
Exactly. Yep. So the structure of that looks like you are receiving a payment from the trustee, which is the amount of the COPs that you sold. And then you are repaying that upfront payment over time over that multi-year structure.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So moving on to a little bit about the credit fundamentals behind it, as far as what we look at when we actually go to sell COPs in the market. You know, leased property is obviously the primary, that's the basis of this transaction. It can be the project that is being financed, or it can be something completely unrelated, but obviously still owned by the issuer. When we are not using the project that's being financed, we typically try to find an asset that's approximately equal in value. So as an example, if you knew you were going to do a $10 million financing, but you don't want to use the building that you're going to be constructing, then we try to find something that's, you know, somewhere in the range of, we'll say, you know, $8.5 to $11.5 million. It doesn't need to be exact or super precise, but we kind of try to find something generally in the same range. And we usually look at that from like an insured value, just because most that's the most common reference that most issuers have. Some go through the process of getting appraisals, but really that insured value or replacement value is what we're looking for as far as the value of the leased property. When we are working on COPs that are being sold to the public market, so your traditional institutional investors, they've become a lot more lenient over the years of what they will accept as leased property. I will say that was definitely true as of 6 months ago. The market has changed a lot, obviously, through the first half of this year, and COPs in general typically are the credit that's hit first when there's a market downturn, just because of that subject to annual appropriation nature of the credit. But really over the last, I'd say, decade, for sure, the last 5 years, we have really been able to get a lot more lenient with what we're using for the leased property. So we've done transactions that have open space or parks as a leased asset, rec centers, golf courses, etc. We are starting to see, depending on what leased property is chosen, some investors may demand a higher interest rate, a little bit more yield for that, just given the market that we are in right now. But that is really incremental. This is not talking about you borrowing at 3% versus 5%. We're really talking about more like borrowing at 3% versus, 3.1% or 3.05%. It's not like we're talking about huge differences in interest rates. Commercial banks, on the other hand, are very concerned about the essentiality of the leased property. But in this instance, our assumption, as far as the conversations that we've had so far with staff of both the city and the fire district, is that if either entity were to enter into a COP, it would likely be a longer term financing. So, closer in the range of 20 years or so, which is really outside of the realm of what a bank would typically be interested in lending their credit to. So we're focusing a little bit more in this conversation on the institutional investors assuming a public offering of COPs. And like I said, they are a little bit more flexible, and that, may come in handy depending on some of the stuff that Jason's going to walk through in the next section, and some of the options for the city and the fire district in this context. From a credit rating perspective, COPs are typically notched 1 or 2 ratings below the underlying general obligation bond rating. So as an example, if the issuer has a general obligation bond rating of AA, so right kind of in the middle of that AA category, the COP then would typically be rated AA minus, so one rating notch below that general obligation bond rating. And that notch is due to that annual appropriation nature of the credit. That's the essentially increased risk of the obligation itself. The only time we really see a 2-notch distinction is if the asset if it's not considered essential, and that's really only by Moody's. They're the only rating agency that really considers essentiality of the asset when they're applying the rating. But in this context, depending on where these conversations go and what ends up happening, if there is a financing to be done, we would assume, as an example, from a fire district perspective, all fire district facilities are considered essential, as are most municipal buildings. So, city halls, justice facilities, police stations, et cetera. So for the most part, as if we're kind of sticking to the more traditional COP route for these conversations, we don't really have any concerns about that 2-notch distinction, unless we start going down the path of parks and open space.
Does the notch or 2-notch distinction make it more expensive to do COPs than general?
Exactly. Yes, but it's kind of the same thing about the, using an essential asset versus non-essential. And when we were talking a few minutes ago on the top of this slide, it is not a this difference of like a whole percentage point. We typically say the 1-notch distinction, particularly if you're still within the AA category, is maybe 5 basis points at most, so 0.05%. If let's say you're AA minus rating, and then so your COP rating ends up in the single A category at an A+, That may widen out that spread a little bit, but really we wouldn't see anything more than probably 10 basis points of difference in interest rate from that one notch distinction. Any other questions about just COP structures in generally? Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Jason to speak a little bit more in detail about your current circumstance. All right.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Maddie. As Meshi said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the more specifics related to the city of Durango and the Durango Fire Protection District project. And this is based on conversations we've had with both the city and the fire district over the last few months. So from our understanding is that, both the city and the fire district have sufficient annual revenues to make debt service or lease payments, and would like to explore issuing COPs to fund their respective portions of a new building that would be a joint building between the fire district and the police building. And this would be over on the River City Hall property, as opposed to the property that the fire district had purchased from the school district. Our understanding is that there's currently a city facility there as well as a fire district facility there, and that the land is currently owned by the city. So really what we're kind of looking at is both entities wanting to issue COPs. So we kind of laid out three options here. We'll touch base on each of these. We'll reference a couple other transactions that have been done within the state of Colorado that are similar, although there isn't one that's exactly what the district and the school district, the fire district and the city are looking to do. But we have kind of dug into those. We have spoken to bond counsel about those, so we have some information on those as well. But from option one, it's really each entity issues COPs and utilizes a different asset for the leased property. Again, as Maddie said, when we're doing COPs, we can use the project that's being financed as the leased property, or we can use a different project for the leased property, depending on the project and the needs. Option two would be one entity issuing COPs utilizing their portion of the to-be-constructed facility as a leased property, and then another entity issuing COPs using another piece of leased property. And the third option would be that each entity issues COPs using their respective proportion to be constructed as the leased property. And the nuances of these really come down to the legalities of it. Right now, we understand that there's still a lot to be discussed on the project. The applicable use of each of these options is really going to kind of come down and depend on what the facility looks like, the cost of the facility. For example, one similar transaction was the town of Avon and the fire district. The town of Avon issued COPs and used their portion of the leased property of their new project as the leased property, whereas the fire district, this was a joint facility, the fire district issued GO bonds, essentially brought cash to the transaction. But what was the leased property for Avon COPs was their specific portion, and that was a joint facility that each had specific uses for each entity, and then had some shared common space. That shared common space was not really captured in the lease purchase transaction. It was really just the town of Avon's portion that they were financing, which they used for COPs for. The land on which the property is going to be built is an issue, but there are workarounds for that. In the Avon case, Avon did own the land. They actually sold the land to the fire district, and so that was actually carved up separately. From talking to bond counsel, we have also determined that you could just do a site lease. You could do a site lease from the city to the fire district for that portion of land of which the facility is going to be built on too. Again, it really kind of depends on the ultimate structure of each one of these options. Really depends on what the plan, are there going to be multiple buildings on the same campus? Is it going to be one building? So there are a lot of options that we can work through. And right now we don't see any legal challenges to it. It's just going to have to be really kind of well thought through as the project is being developed. The last build on there is really just assume that some of these items are going to be formalized in an IGA between the two entities as you guys are moving forward and developing and designing the facility. One other thing I do want to bring up is when we were talking to Butler Snow's bond counsel earlier this week, we were looking at an article in the Durango Herald, and one of the points in that article were that the current facility is in a floodplain. The River City Hall property is in a 100-year floodplain and might have some environmental issues. So we need to make sure that that was cleared up. If it wasn't a floodplain, that would make it a little bit more difficult for us to use those properties as the lease property. But I think it just kind of depends on are there remedies for that, and can that be rectified before that site was utilized for the COPs. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions about the options or anything that we've kind of laid out there.
I'm actually, thank you. I wanted to turn to the city manager and also to the chief here in a sense of setting. I should have probably started with this. This is one thing that we're considering. It's not necessarily something that you're proposing. But did you guys also want to make some comments about your thinking that, or also I'd also like to invite the city attorney and the fire district, because you also may have experience with working with the CO.
So I think, from our perspective, this was an option that was brought up to us. I think it was from our financial advisors, probably the easiest would be the right word to say, but probably the more obvious option that they saw coming through. So as we were going through specifically for my management of the council, it's a good opportunity to bring this up just to kind of begin that educational process for you. So you can kind of understand what COPs are, kind of get an opportunity to ask questions. If this indeed becomes the option we chose, there was already kind of groundwork set up for it. Also, as we're doing some public meeting, the public's kind of starting to see some of the financial options that we're considering. So that's where it really is. It's not a part of correction yet. We're near that, but just more of a, here's an option that looks like it might be the most readily available. Here's what it looks like, and an opportunity for you to ask questions.
I think from the fire district's perspective, one of the things that we get asked all the time in discussions with the public about the project things is, well, are you going to need to raise taxes in order to do this, or how would you finance this? And through the course of the opportunities we've had to present on this, we've represented that we believe that the capital money that we have set aside since we got our mill rate increase, one of the initiatives on that was to cover our future capital needs. And so we've made it clear that we believe that we've got funding mechanisms in place as far as revenue goes to cover this. However, we don't have the cash to cover it. And so for us, we believe that our best opportunity here is to do the certificate of participation, just so that we have it's the way that a publicly or a tax funded entity goes and gets a mortgage on. So that has been our intent as we go through this process for how we would manage through whatever the project is.
And Dirk, I think the city's got experience in working with COPs. Maybe you want to just remind us of.
Sure. The two most recent experiences the city has is Wilson Road construction, which done with COPs. That was using, I believe, the service center as the property. Same the shape that it is. The other more recent one was a short-term situation where the city had an opportunity to buy a piece of property adjacent to the airport. That was again a pretty short-term funding, but that was done with COPs using that building as the leased property. So those are the two most recent. And as you know, some criticism of those uses versus an election, and that's a question that the city council will have to address and look at. Any funding like this would have to go through vetting and bond council review and bond opinions and so forth. But those are the two most recent examples that we used.
And Bud, anything from a legal perspective from the fire district?
No, not really. The fire district has never had any general obligation debt, and they never used COPs or lease purchases. They've fortunately been in a position where they've been able to utilize cash resources. Lease purchase arrangements are quite common for equipment. Fire trucks are often purchased in that way, but because of the way the assets came to the district through Animus and Turbos and the city, There was no need to do that. So this would be their first go around with this type of financing. But as the chief said, that's sort of been the promise they made to the taxpayers, is that we built this money in, we have a capital improvements plan, and we believe the funding is there to follow through with funding those capital needs that we have without going back and asking for more increases.
Thank you. Questions of Jason and Maddie?
Yeah, if you allow me.
Yeah, please.
William Bosman, Syracuse City Council. Thank you, Jason and Maddie, for that presentation. I've done some research also on the COP funding options, and I noticed that they carry a higher rate and that they are a bit more complex to set up, and they might have higher costs for insurance and the IGA, etc. And I'm not sure why we only got a presentation on COPs, but I would like to see a comparison between this funding mechanism and other typical municipal funding mechanisms like bonds, to see which one is financially cheapest. Just shopping around. In the end, I think no matter how you finance, it's still the same way. Either you have issue bonds and you pay bonds off, or you do this kind of financing and you pay lease. But bottom line is the same, except the COP doesn't require voter authorization. So it does commit our city to a long-term payment, even though we call it appropriations for lease. And we commit our city councils in the future as well for this. So I understand the fire district has a bit of a luxury problem in having that income available. So I guess my question is, are we going to get the comparison of all the funding mechanisms and an evaluation of the cost, which ones make most sense? And maybe a second question is, this was a presentation on COP only. Why is it only on COP? What is the background? Is this because you already thought this is the most likely scenario, or is this? No, let's leave it at that. Maddie, I think that's mostly questions for you.
I'll turn it over to the
For
city
me,
manager.
as I had stated earlier, this was the first one that was identified by the FAA. I stated that this wasn't a decision that had been made, that we were going through it. So I think that answered your question. Why this was brought up is this was their first one to say, here's an option that you could provide. Yes, it doesn't go to a voter approved bond, but it can be ruled out. Also, I would look at it as living within our means, because we don't have to issue another tax. This is able to live within what I believe we can probably do within our general fund. Still have to look at it. There's other pieces that need to fall in. So we're at the beginning process. So I think where you're looking at is like coming to an end, having council make a decision. I wouldn't do that to you in a matter of weeks. We still have to look into it. We still have to talk with the FAs and get their expert opinion of, okay, how does this work through? And that's why right now with COPs, we can bring it to you as we're.
Okay, so we're getting more presentations on.
Possibly as we go through what options are available.
Do you?
I
I
think-
don't want to interrupt.
I think it's the comparison for you, key one to make an informed decision later on, but I think this is a good first step.
I just want to follow up on something that Councilor Boston was suggesting about committing future councils. So I understand, just to make sure I really understand for my own purposes, I understand that the definition here that it said that we will approve this annually. And so can we talk about that more so I really have a good understanding of that?
For sure, I'll pass it to the FAs, but you can't commit a future council. So what they had mentioned was you would do your best effort and intent to do so, but it would still need to be appropriated annually by future councils. So it doesn't actually commit. I think it was best intent, and I'll kick it over to the financial advisors to explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Maddie said, as opposed to a voter authorized debt or where it is a debt obligation where an entity is essentially making a covenant that it will pay the debt service on an annual basis. COPs are a situation where it is an annual appropriated budget item. But it is the expectation of the investor community that that entity will continue to make that budget appropriation. If in a COP lease purchase situation, if an entity who has executed a COP does not make that annual budget appropriation, there will likely be capital market repercussions from that perspective, also from the rating agencies. So it is a legal option that an entity can walk away from it and not appropriate. However, there could be some capital markets repercussions. As Maddie said at the beginning of this presentation, COPs are very, very widely used in Colorado, from the state of Colorado all the way down to small special districts to finance capital projects. And to, you know, in the history of COPs, at least in the last 30 years, there was only one entity, and I believe it was in the early 1990s, where the city of Sheridan in Colorado in the metro area did not appropriate on some COPs, and that item is still talked about. As Maddie said, that annual appropriation risk does lead to a slightly higher interest rate. But again, to be clear, and to answer the question that did come up, we are more than happy to, we can put together, and we do this all the time for a lot of our clients, is, you know, assuming that an entity would issue GO bonds or a limited tax GO bond or a COP, or a sales tax, you know, whatever options you'd like to see, we can lay out that the costs of those. And I think what you'll see is it's not significant. You know, as Maddie said, maybe one is a 3, maybe one's a 3.25%. The cost of issuance are slightly higher for a COP because there are additional costs in there in terms of the land work. But again, not substantially. I would say, if the cost of issuance of a normal transaction is $125,000, maybe for a COP it's $160,000. So, but we are more than happy to put a comparison together, the cost of different financing options as the city and the fire district continue to evaluate options that are available to them.
One question as we're talking about this, what is the typical term of this lease agreement?
Yeah, I mean, we see anything as short as, we're working on a transaction for Fort Collins later this year where the lease term will be 10 years. And we have seen them as long as 25, 30 years. It really depends on, a lot of times we're looking at the affordability of the payment. So, if we start, let's say, with a 20-year term, and that annual payment is too expensive from a budgeting perspective for a client, we can run it, either as a lower project fund or extend the term out to 25 years and see if that kind of helps alleviate some of those budget pressures. But there's no sort of hard and fast, it has to be this amount of time. Particularly in this instance, you're talking about financing assets that will have a useful life, far beyond what we're talking about most likely for terms. But 30 is kind of the max. What we typically see is probably more in the 20-25 range.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is we just sold some COPs. We're a municipal advisor for some COPs for Grand County Fire Protection District earlier this summer. And when we were initially engaged, the size of their project, they were thinking about a 20-year term. But as they started to work through the project and really kind of getting it scoped and getting to a point where they had a guaranteed maximum price contract, that, obviously, as along with everything we're seeing out there, the cost of the project started to increase pretty substantially. So we did end up moving that out to a 25-year term. We do have one more slide, and I'll just hit on it, a couple other things just to make sure. I know there might be some more questions on these items on this last slide. Generally, we say to complete a COP, it's about 3 months. That is not including the time to finalize an IGA here, like we would need here between the two entities. Also, that assumes essentially that the project is essentially almost fully complete and designed. We do think it makes sense for entities, especially smaller ones like a fire district, to have a guaranteed maximum price contract in place prior to us selling those COPs, to make sure, or any debt financing really, to make sure that we are generating the sufficient funding needed to complete that project, especially in the face of high cost overruns that we're seeing right now. So again, with that Grand Fire, we did end up delaying it about a month as the district continued to work through its GMP. And make sure that we can get the proceeds that they needed to complete the facility that was best interest of their district. In that 3-month time frame, we do draft legal documents. We would get a rating. There's the formal approval process. by the governing body. And then it's pricing, setting the interest rates and closing the transaction, which is when the funds are available. So again, that whole process, we generally say takes 3 months from the time you tell us to get moving until then, but that does not take into account all the lead time of which you're looking at in terms of community engagement, the IGA formulation. So that really is the end of our presentation, but please feel free to continue to ask us any questions that you may have.
I did want to give the chief a chance to say if you got anything else to add here, and then I have a question for the city.
Yeah, no, I just, it occurred to me when you asked your question, that one of the easiest ways for me to understand the certificate of participation process is, because of Tabor, we weren't allowed to indent future governing bodies. And so it's the nature of that puts us in a situation where instead of taking a mortgage on the asset, we're leasing it to own. And that gets us around the requirements of Tabor, allowing us to authorize money each year for paying for it, rather than a long-term obligation as we took a traditional mortgage. And so it just is the way that entities like ours have to borrow money across the long term without getting long-term for it.
Interesting, and I'm glad we're clarifying this, so that I didn't understand previously, is that it is long-term, and I like what you said, it is like a mortgage. So it's not just to get into the facility and to rehab the facility, it's over 25, potentially 20 to 30 years, okay? So it's very helpful to understand for all of us, I think, because it is a long-term. And again, you think you have the revenues for this type of term, for the term.
It's confounding though, because we all know that what we know is we don't have any idea how to know what this project is actually going to cost us.
Right.
And so we have to be moving through the process and expending money to get to the point where we can determine that. And we very well may find, like other clients, that the price tag on this is more than we anticipated, in which case it gives us the opportunity to range where our payments might be, with the flexibility of expanding out the time frame in which we can.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, and I'm not certain who's the person to answer, so it might be the city manager, the city attorney, or Cynthia as well. For council's information, explain how we do the budgeting for the airport payments. We issued certificates of participation, and so every year it comes up to us. Somebody take us, council, through how we're not committing necessarily, but we appropriate every year it comes up.
Yeah, the airport was such a short-term funding that I think it, and I'll confess, I don't remember the time exactly, Tony would know this, but I think the whole process was completed and the lease purchase arrangement with COPs were actually retired, because that was a bridge essentially to get to some funding from the FAA, as I recall. So the better example is probably Wilson Gulch, and Cynthia may be in a better position, but that's just part of the annual budget. And there's a line item in there to pay those COPs on Wilson Gulch. Just that one, and also there was a shared arrangement on Wilson Gulch, as you remember. So none of it wasn't a shared ownership, it was a shared payment arrangement. But Cynthia can address annual appropriation for Wilson Gulch.
Dirk is absolutely correct that the airport loan was originally on the way for FAA dollars to pay that. It was only about a year-ish we had was outstanding. But Wilson Gulch, it is just part of the annual budget process. With the line item in there for the most debt service payments.
And just another part to add, just as we look at terms and having those discussions, that obviously we need to find out what the cost is going to be for joint fire police station. But if that project goes through, then we do have a police station property that can be sold, that can also then provide funding to pay through and pay down a debt or a lease purchase, whichever way we want to look at it. Usually your COP is going to be a little bit more flexible if you issue a GO. They like to look at their term to be a little bit longer and gain their interest. So also looking at flexibility and how that would work into it. So there's some parts that we still don't have those answers of how that would all work into it. But there's opportunities where we could get cash influx for properties that we offload if that's what the council chooses to do, to then bring in more money to pay off some of that at a shorter term.
You have another question?
Thank you. I was wondering if, well, first of all, I look forward to seeing that comparison, which obviously involved. But one of the options that I might suggest we include, if it's interesting if possible, since we have in the city, we have over 80 million fund balances, some of it restricted. I was wondering, are some of those fund balances available to loan against? So instead of going out using, because our return on those funds are maybe not. Is that an option that could be at least looked at on a very high level? And I'm sure there's a lot of restrictions, so not most of them more than one. That might be another thing to consider.
I need to, we need
I want to
to,
clarify that because that's not accurate.
it's not accurate.
No, we need a point of information there about the actual availability of fund balances.
I'm gonna turn to Cynthia. We do not have 80 million in cash. We need to make that very clear.
Available fund balances. There's a difference between committed fund balances and available. Just for the record, it's important.
Are you asking for general fund only or for all funds?
I was referring to when I said 80 million is the presentation that was given maybe a month ago by finance that shows, I think it was 87 million total fund balance, restricted and unrestricted across all funds in our city.
And
That
assets,
is the
all types of assets.
assets are not included.
So it's restricted, it's the key word there. So
Restricted,
what we really,
unrestricted, permitted funds.
so restricted funds would be available for COPs, and so we have to only look at them.
Oh, we're talking about fact check. So the fact check is a month ago, finance during the public their presentation, and there was 86, I think, million at the end of 2021 total fund balances across all the fund balances, because this seems to be happening quite a bit, like a question on the numbers. These are finance numbers, restricted, unrestricted, across the board. 86.
I think it's important, and we're going to end with this point, and we'll allow you to answer your question. I think it's important to recognize that when you talk about available funding or using it, the implication is that it's available as as financing available. And the point that's trying to be made is that that's not the number that's available. So I think we're going to end with that. And Jason, if you could answer the question, please. Thank you.
Can somebody repeat the question? I wasn't exactly sure what question that was posed.
It was looking at using some of our available assets
Can we use those?
to finance.
Since I asked the question, maybe I'll rephrase.
Yeah, I mean, it is, definitely a lot of our clients, if they have fund balance that is available and can be used, they do use that as part of a capital cost and could potentially have a slightly smaller COP. Those are issues that are frequently done. It just depends again on the cost of the project and the fund balance. So, it is important from a rating perspective of a municipality to maintain certain levels of fund balance. And those are certain things that we also help to make sure we work through with our clients as well. But yes, if there is available cash to contribute to a project, there can be a combination of cash and COPs to help, fund the full project cost.
Kevin has it pulled up.
Yes, thank you, Devin. You want to?
Sure, no problem. So, as far as what's available for unassigned, it's 7.3, that's our projected ending fund balance.
Million,
7.3
not
million, that's out of the general fund. What I think Councilor Bosman is referring to is the unaudited projected ending fund balance for 2021. However, that takes us back into the presentation where those have to be utilized for either specific ballot language or for specific purposes for water, sewer, and those types of things. But truly unassigned, available for any purpose that council listed, this is that 7.3 million in the general fund.
A difference of 73 million not available. So on that point,
And I think the point I made is that total fund balance is 86 million, and that is undisputed. I am not saying.
point of order. are out of order now. We're not discussing the budgeting. We're discussing the options here, and I'm going to call this. If anyone,
Can I ask a question? I could just switch, not switch topic, but thank you for the presentation and clarifying the COPs. I think that it's a great option for acquisition and construction of property over time, rather than depleting resources, ruining our rating, all those things. And it shows that we can pay off early, like the airport example that's in Big. How long was do we still have the Wilson Gulch?
Yes.
And how long is that legal term? Do you know? Okay, sorry.
Or Cynthia, we flashed all these.
I know.
Like she's been here for decades.
Yeah, so
And expect her.
I was like concerning about like holding other councils, and basically if other councils, future councils decide this isn't the route they want to go, there's other avenues to either pay the COP off or do a different term of financing, go to voters at that point in time, right? Like we have other options.
There are going to be other options. There probably will be a term that the COP couldn't be paid off any sooner than, just because the lender is probably going to want some return on their interest. So there may be a step where after 5 years, obviously you can pay it off, but you couldn't pay it off sooner than 5 years. So there may be a little bit on that, but yes, you could, after 5 years, if that was called the council, and would say, let's just pay it all off.
Okay, and then when we were looking at, Councilor Bosman made a comment about comparisons, like looking at, so the only other comparisons is what going to election and voter authorized debt, correct? Like those are the three options, correct?
Yeah, I mean, really, and there's, as Maddie said on the initial slides, there's different types of voter authorized debt. Could be a pure general obligation bond, which is backed by the full taxing authority of the city. That would be it's kind of the highest rating and your lowest borrowing cost. Then you'd have a sales tax bond just backed by sales taxes. Then you'd have like a limited tax general obligation bond, which would be no tax increase, just payable from available revenues, and then COPs. So we can lay those out for you. Again, the financing cost between each of those is not going to be substantial, but we are happy to lay those all out for you to make sure that you understand the different costs for those four options. But yes, I mean, even within the voter authorization, there's 2 or 3 different types of voter authorization an entity could go and get from their electorate.
I guess my question was, I know you can lay them all out for us. I felt like it was a little bit laid out for us. So what comparison is Olivier actually, or Councilor Boston's actually looking for to make sure we're like, because I felt like it was kind of laid out and
again, overall costs, they will have slightly higher interest rates. So again, if we're saying, a pure general obligation bond backed by property tax raising authority would be your lowest borrowing cost, down to maybe a COP or a sales tax might be the slightly higher. So what we would show you is the total repayment cost over the life of the term of the financing, so that you can see that there's a different total repayment cost between each option.
And I also think like more important for me, which was in here, was the advantages and disadvantages of both, because I think that's going to weigh more on the council than slight percentage increases when we get paid off potentially early and whatnot. So okay.
Yeah, so but it's good information. I think for us to see it publicly and to have a conversation.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you for providing this. It's information only, and I know that we've got much more work to do. I also want to keep us moving on the agenda. So I do thank you both for presenting this to us. And I'm sure it's the first of other conversations that we'll be having. So I appreciate that. Next on our agenda is kind of updates, and I wanted to turn to the chief for any that you wanted to start with, or then the city manager.
Or,
Okay, I'll go forward, or wherever you want to do. You want to go first?
No, go ahead.
So yeah, just as an update of where we're at today. So we've been meeting every other week, so bi-monthly since like June, early June, late May, early June, going through. We've had some pretty good discussions continuing to move forward. Hal and Randy meet with us. In my group, I have finance, community development, at our meetings, as well as police, just so that we're able to begin to have those discussions and make decisions. So we can always like, hey, let's come back. So we're going at a regular pace. We finished obviously our MOU that was approved by the Council and the Durango Fire Prevention District Board. So thank you for that. We are very close now to having a draft MOU sent to share design costs. That's really where we've been focusing our time. Obviously, the DFPD has a design consultant already on board. There were a couple asks from the city that they would want to jump on board with that. They also have a architect that specializes in construction of these facilities, as well as a landscape architect that Al has been gracious enough to say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So bringing those on board, the landscape architect being one of the more important ones right now, because that allows us to begin starting public charrette, public meetings, public input meetings to kind of see what the public would like to see in that building, as far as how does it look as it butts against the river walk and see where we're going there. So that gets us moving pretty quickly on that portion of it. And then the MOU that we're working would actually split the cost of design so that it would be 50-50 between both boards. So working through that right now. So that was what we finished with today. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to begin diving in a little bit more in regards to the financing options for both, also the property and how that works in regards to the exchange properties, we exchange leases, everything is on the table. I think that we have a partner, making sure that when we're looking at cash flow and those types of instances, that it has to work for both, and seeing where that goes through. So we've had some pretty good preliminary discussions on it. I think Hal knows where we stand in regards to what we would like to do. I don't think Hal has some other opportunities of what he's looking at, what they want to be able to do from a city perspective, just put it in the open. We'd rather just exchange leases since it's down at the River City Mall is our property now, building a building on a property that we give away doesn't really make much sense to us, but that doesn't mean we've closed the door on it, but it's just something that we thought of and discussed. We haven't had an opportunity to really discuss more into that. We've been really focusing on let's get the design team going so we can kind of see what our costs are going to be and what that building would look like. So we continue to have those conversations, discussions. Obviously, we are interested in the big picture building. Not so much the 9R historic building. We have 25 employees that are community development that are in River City Hall that have to find another spot for it if that becomes a joint fire and police building. So we're taking a look at what opportunities we may have to combine some of our facilities and cities and make it work, which then may offer some opportunity to have other properties dissolvable that we can actually put in and get some more cash on. So I think the conversations have gone great. I really appreciate the ability to have bi-weekly meetings with Hal and bring in. I think we're really moving on a lot of the initiatives that we set out.
You know, I would concur completely. I've been impressed actually with the pace that we've been able to set with the group. It was an aha moment for me when we walked into the first one of these, and I came bebopping in by myself, and Jose had his entire team of city staff assembled there to start these discussions. I think that it's been made clear to me by my board that establishing a timeline, which is something that we contemplated in the original MOU, is something that's really important. We're from the fire district standpoint, we feel compelled to make sure that we keep on moving along. We feel like we were at a point from a site plan development standpoint where we were just about ready to file and try to move forward. We recognize the value of the partnership that this is creating, the opportunity to do something that really does meet the community's expectations for service as well as cooperation. But we don't want it to take years and years to get to that point where the men and women that work for me are going to work every day in substandard conditions. And I don't ever go to the police department if I can help it, but if I would say that Rice and Bob's men and women that work for them are in similar conditions. And so the time frame that this happens in is of utmost concern. And I would tell you that Jose has exceeded my expectations as far as keeping this on track and moving forward. We're trying to make decisions that are teamwork based. So we have actually, as you heard folks from Hilltop describe, we have now entered into an agreement with them as well and are trying to use the same finance advisors as we do the city already had, so that we have synergy there. In similar fashion, we have entered into an agreement, at least verbal at this point, that we would move forward with the same bond counsel that that the city is used to working with, so that we can have a bond counsel firm that will come and play and settle this for both of us. And I think that the more decisions that we can make like that, where we're similarly aligned as organizations, is really going to help from a timeframe standpoint and from getting us all headed in exactly the same direction on the same course. So I think that's really good. I was able, across the last 2 weeks, I walked away from the last meeting with an assignment that we were to contact the architect that our police chief had seen the work of and was interested in using and consulting with for the design of the police elements of this facility. And I think Bryce and I are going to get the opportunity later today to actually call and have a conversation with the architect of record for the Montrose Police Department, Grand Junction Police Department. And we're interested in using them and having them partner as a police design entity with our architect that's going to be designing the building. We actually come from a situation where we had a similar arrangement for fire department design, when we designed the fire station that we thought was going to be on the railroad parking site. So our architect is on board with that, and I think that that'll be an easy transition. Live Group has indicated that they are used to working in partnerships like that. So I think that'll be a good point of success and will help to assure that in a similar fashion of where the fire department was 5 years ago when we started doing capital projects. You know, your command staff at the police department has never built a police station, and they want to make sure that they get it right the first time. This is an awful lot of money of the communities that we're looking at spending on. So I think the more robust the design team can be, the better it will be. Similar fashion, we're having talks with, we keep calling them landscape architects, and these folks are not telling us where we're going to put a tree or a bush. They really are site design professionals that we're looking at bringing on board. I can tell you that the firm that we have been talking with has done work for the city before. They actually work very closely with the development group and our local contractors. So it was great to get to spend our money in Durango. And I think that that'll bring a huge element to the table with regards to making this an appealing project to our community, both from the riverfront side as well as from the town side of this potential building. And I think that it will help us to get to the point where we understand much better and can manage much better the community input that we're anticipating getting on this thing. If I've learned anything from the way that I've been beating my head against the wall for the last year and a half over this project, it is that we need to open venues to be able to hear the community's input, take that into consideration, and figure out what we can make work best for all of us. So lesson learned.
Wonderful.
Only thing, if I could just add, because it came up was floodplain. We had a conversation about it this morning. Kevin had notified us that they actually are redoing FEMA's readjusting the floodplain boundaries, and that it does seem that at that property they will go closer to the river, so we probably will gain some of that, but also there's other things we can do design-wise that will try to mitigate some of those areas. So it is something that we are actively discussing.
I wanted to look to our colleagues on the fire district board. They've been fairly quiet. I wanted to offer opportunities to ask questions. Sure.
I would say from our perspective, I mean, I think that Hal's done a phenomenal job of trying to get this project to the point where we can start construction. So I think our interest, and I hopefully am not speaking on behalf of everybody, so feel free to step in, but our interest is to ensure that we do this and we push the timeline so that we can get to the point where our fire district personnel have a safe place to work out of to serve the downtown community. That's really critical for us. So, for example, I would say we have to get these bi-monthly meetings on the calendar as soon as possible for the general public to be aware of. And I would also say the public design charrettes, I believe it's how you refer to it. I would want those on the calendar sooner than later, because I think it's really important for people to be able to plan so that they can be involved and we all just know where we stand. And then as we're working towards financing and everything else, I mean, I would say from fire district perspective, we know what we want to do in the direction we'd like to take as far as financing. So I would anticipate that the city may have some more work to do internally, and obviously we get a whole project picture. But construction takes a long time, and design takes a long time. So the longer we kind of push out the timing, the longer it's going to take before people can kind of start service. So that we're going to just continue, we're going to continue to push on and just making sure that we stay on track so that we can have a new downtown station for people to work at.
And I will just respond, I can appreciate the urgency, but I also know that you can appreciate the need to doing it right. And this is a significant asset of the cities. And so that will involve a lot of participation and discussion and analysis. So anything else that we need to bring up or have it discussed?
I just wanted to say, this is a great meeting. I really appreciate that the fire board and that the city are working as partners toward finding the right solutions that are the benefit for both our groups as well as for the community. And I just want to say how much I appreciate that partnership. It's a different conversation than we've been having. So thank you.
I would just add to that we hear your concerns over timeline. And we heard those also through the MOU process. We are well aware that we too are actually looking forward to moving forward this process and engaging the community along the way. But we're excited to see what comes out of this process. So we're that's why Jose is moving forward. He's got that direction from council, and we're looking forward to those continued discussions. But we do have to be diligent in our process, but we too are looking forward to forward momentum and taking some action sooner than later.
Yeah, so this partnership has been great. We've been holding joint meetings with you prior to the specific project. And so I think we're excited about it, but to reiterate what Sam said is that we just really got to be intentional. And now we have a project, right? So our financial viability, our vision for what that looks like in partnership, really got to stay on task. So getting something on the calendar every other month is going to be really important and key for us. Get this project to the point where our community can see what that's going to look like, how it's going to impact them on the end, and what it's going to do for our emergency services, both on the fire and the law enforcement side. Agreed.
On that note, I'm going to adjourn and thank you all for coming and for the presenters.